I already told you I plan to mess everything up. That is my goal. Thank you for that introduction. I do love when introductions go horribly, horribly funny. And that was good. As you can see, as I said, covered. There is no Laurier symbols. It's just a nice navy tie. So we can move past that, I hope. I'm sorry. So usually when I begin this talk, I usually do it with a little bit of music. However, due to me not getting my tech requirements in on time and also just coming off a night class that I taught last night, it just didn't happen. Oh, told you I'll screw it up. So this is the lyrics of a song that I usually start this lecture off with, which has nothing to do with Six Nations or First Nations or any Native Indigenous group. It has to do with Ireland. And the reason why I do this is because I would like to put the idea of First Nations in the First World War in a global context. If we read the lyrics to this song, we can tell that it was written probably midway through the First World War, and it's an Irishman talking to a recruiting sergeant. And midway through, there is a very lovely line that says, "English men for English wars." This Irishman does not want to go and fight in the First World War. He's heard the stories, he's not doing it, he's not buying the recruiting sergeant's very playful jib of how warm it is in the trenches when it's snowing, how it's just very lovely and accommodating. He's not buying it. And midway through the war, this is the idea and some of the popular imagery we have of all the First World War. This idea of a large imperial conflict that some people really had no reason being a part of. But that wasn't always the case. The First World War for colonized people is one of the first times we see enthusiasm, or one of the first times we see enthusiasm for fighting for the British Empire, followed immediately by not wanting to do it. Casualty rates, the barbarism of warfare, it all starts to come back. But what it also shows some of these colonized people is the fact that they are equals. They can go into war and fight the same as their the imperial colonizers that were around them. And it was the first time also that colonized groups from Canada, Africa, New Zealand, India, all meet each other. And they start sharing stories about what it's like back home and start to realize there's a lot more commonalities than differences between them. So it really is a watershed moment. As I said though, early in the war, we do find a lot of First Nations peoples very eager to enlist. Now I will preface this talk by saying I work predominantly with Six Nations of the Grand River Territory just outside of Brantford. I will try to give you a Canada-wide context of the First World War, but a lot of my examples are going to come from Grand River. So hopefully that's what you wanted to hear because that's happening and I'm not changing that right now in mid-stride. So one of our first examples is Alfred Stiers. He was actually working, he was a Six Nations man. He was working actually in his field when he heard that the 4th Battalion, one of Canada's early overseas battalions, was recruiting in Hagersville. He immediately went to his neighbor's house, said, "Look after my crops," and enlisted. We also have people like Cameron D. Brandt. He was already a serving officer, Six Nations descent of Joseph Brandt, obviously. He was already a serving officer in the 37th Haldeman Rifles. He enlisted and brought his cousins, Elgin Brandt and Frank Montour, and they all enlisted in the 4th Battalion. It's actually estimated that probably before the end of August 1914, so remember the war is declared, but we're not even accepting recruits yet, at least 10 Six Nations men from Grand River had already enlisted in the overseas battalions. This number by the end of November of that time would actually be increased to about 60 people. So there is an eagerness. But let's look at the stats. The Canadian population, the First Nations population, Canada mobilizes that much during the war. That's how many serve overseas. And we have about 4,000 estimated First Nations people. And look at the percentage of population and the casualties. We're seeing basically all First Nations people across Canada actually fighting on par with the rest of the Canadian population. So that's an interesting little thing to keep in mind. But what's really interesting is when we look at what this looks like on community levels. This is a chart of just a few communities in Western Canada. The Pegasus Band has 118 males, 20 enlist and go overseas, 11 are killed, 3 are wounded, and 4 are gassed. Think of what that means for that small community when they only have that many more men that can carry on in the post-war years. Same goes with the St. Peter's Band, 127, 33 go overseas, 7 killed, 8 wounded, 1 gassed. That's a huge impact on some of these communities. The Algonquin community of Golden Lake, Ontario, by war's end only had 3 able-bodied men left on their reserve that could be recruited. Alwinook, Ontario, 50% of their able-bodied men enlisted. File Hills Indian Reservation, it's a small missionary community. They actually, all of their able-bodied men go overseas. The Micmac and Maliseet of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, both communities, 50%. Once again, half of their community goes overseas. Six Nations Grand River. We have, on counting, because we're with the centenary of the First World War, we're reevaluating what we know. We now have at least 325 people going overseas of an eligible man rate of probably about 1,000 people. So high enlistment rates. One of the things I think I have another. Oh man, this thing is super sensitive. I love this. There we go. There's another File Hills. This one's an interesting photo because in the middle we actually have the community chiefs and the Indian commissioner in the middle before the men went overseas. This is a statistical chart that actually a friend of mine and I worked on. I worked for the Great War Centenary Association, Brantford, Brant County Six Nations, working on the Six Nations end. And what we wanted to prove was what was the percentage of population of Six Nations men going overseas versus the rest of Canada. So as we can see, Six Nations is running across the bottom. And their percentage of population of able-bodied men is 7.2, which if you look at the rest of the provinces, falls either in the middle or above what they were producing as far as male recruits. We also have an Inuit population that has never actually been tallied at this point of how many of them went overseas. The reason for that is, of course, we really weren't keeping accurate records. We actually don't have accurate records to how many First Nations people went overseas. Early in the war, we weren't keeping track. We only started keeping track at about the end of 1915. So there's actually almost a 1.5 year period where we have no idea how many First Nations people and men enlisted. The official estimate for Six Nations Grand River was actually 290, and as I said, we have recently found 325. With the Inuit population, it's a lot harder. There really was zero government in the north yet. Most of the northern government or supervision was done by the Hudson's Bay Company. We do know, however, that at least 15 Inuit from Labrador enlisted in the Royal Newfoundland Regiment. And we do have scattered stories of other ones traveling down on the fur trapping lines and enlisting. This enlistment is also pretty impressive considering there was actually a color barrier when it came to enlistment. It was unofficial. Basically, the local recruiter could really enlist anyone they wanted, but higher up there was actually a concern of getting First Nations people because they weren't sure the Germans would actually show them the civilities of civilized warfare, whatever that term means. I'm still looking into that. If we know anything about the First World War, it stops being quite civilized quite quickly. But there was really a concern about that. And actually, we're going to return to that point near the end of this talk. We're talking about some of the experiences of some of the First Nations men that went overseas. Also, as I said, this is pretty much enlistment by the local recruiter. Not all the time were these men accepted. There was actually a group of Cape Crooker First Nations people that actually were rejected by 4 separate recruiting stations. So it really depended on the relationship the First Nations community had with the non-First Nations community that surrounded them. But let's talk about this eagerness to enlist. Why would that be happening? It sounds very strange. The first one, of course, as I said, integration into the non-First Nations community. Using a Grand River example once again, in 1914, the superintendent, Gordon Smith, actually estimated that there was 1,100 men on Six Nations, of which 390 were not actually employed on the reserve. So there's 390 men that are going into Hamilton, Brantford, Hagersville area and working right alongside the non-First Nations community. So maybe we can look at some of the imperial aspects of non-Native society that might have drawn them into war. Past military experience. When we first start recruiting for the First World War, the Minister of Militia says anybody with past military experience is what I'm looking for. Perfect. We have First Nations people in the rebellions of 1837-38, the Fenian Raids of 1866. We have some in the Boer War. A few actually go to South Africa. And residential schools. 2 residential schools in Canada had officially registered cadet corps. One was the St. Paul's Band on the Blood Reservation out in the Prairies. The other one was the Mohawk Institute. This is a photo of the Mohawk Institute Cadet Corps in 1909. So we are seeing some children growing up with some military training that funneled them into the Canadian system. In some cases during the war, we do see some recruiters trying to recruit directly out of residential schools. However, this was frowned upon by the Department of Indian Affairs. These children were still minors and did need parental permission before, of course, enlisting. Some First Nations actually did have their own militia companies under the Canadian system. Six Nations began theirs as early as 1862. However, this was disbanded soon after in about 1864. However, they still are enlisting with the local militia units. This is a wonderful picture of one of, I think I'm up to 4 Six Nations companies in the Haldeman Rifles. As you can see, they are uniformed, they are armed, and according to their inspection reports, we're better than the non-First Nations people in the regiment. When you read the inspection reports, it's almost like we have 2 separate regiments being evaluated. We have the First Nations side and the non-First Nations side out of Haldeman County. In a study, historian Andrew Orochi, who is actually a Western historian, so I must point that out, he found in a survey of 293 Six Nations veterans, 152 of them had past militia experience. Most of this was with the 26th Middlesex Light Infantry or the 37th Haldeman Rifles. To put this in a fun context for everybody, the Six Nations men made up most of the Middlesex battalion's baseball team and band. And my also favorite, all Six Nations Haldeman Rifles band. This would continue as early as they started being the official band of the Haldeman Rifles in about 1880. And continue right up into when they turned over to the 114th Battalion. We also have in the Prairies, although it's less talked about, some First Nations groups working with the RCMP, helping out in the 1885 resistance. We see some participation that way too. Other reasons for this wanting to participate in the war comes actually with First Nations treaties. Every First Nations group had a relationship with the British Crown at this point through treaties. For Six Nations, it goes a little farther back than some people are familiar with. These are Wampum Belt treaties, the 2-row and the dish with 1 spoon. The 2-row wampum is extremely simple to understand. The 2 purple rows equal the First Nations and the non-First Nation society, and they are going to live on this earth without interrupting with each other. You know that those lines aren't crossing. So that was the original treaty that they had said. You can come and share the land with us, just don't interrupt us. The dish with 1 spoon is another sharing of the land. There is 1 dish, 1 land, and we can all live and share from it. These were set down in the 1600s, 1700s. Their royal relationship with Six Nations continued with a 1667 treaty with the British called the Covenant Chain, which this is the one that really links them militarily. The idea is there would be a silver chain. What do we know about silver? It tarnishes. So the idea is to keep our treaty relationship bright, we will meet and polish our agreement. What's interesting is pre-war, we actually see a polishing of this relationship in the Grand River Territory. Between 1860 and 1919, there were 14 royal and vice-regal visits to the Six Nations Grand River, where they talked about their treaties. There was a living relationship going right up to the First World War of that idea. On the Prairies, if we look at it, there are only 2 generations removed from the numbered treaties their leaders had signed with the British. And they were signed with by Crown representatives on behalf of Queen Victoria. So for many of these communities, they believed they had direct alliances, and they were usually family-based. The Indigenous alliance systems usually have a family component. So when the British were in trouble, they came running. This is confused by some historians because there were some First Nations groups that resisted this idea of let's come running when the British need us. And the reason is during this period we also see an erosion of these treaty relationships. Grand River, for instance, when they got their first offer to mobilize on behalf of the Canadian government in 1914, they said no, we're not going to do it. The reason is they said, we feel the relationship isn't polished enough, and we would like to meet with someone before we commit our troops. What's interesting with Six Nations is they also have this autonomy aspect. So although that was the response from the governing body, it didn't mean the individuals couldn't enlist. And as we see with those early examples, the individuals did enlist. Historians usually bank this to these individuals going against their government and not supporting it. But if you look actually at the relationship, it actually makes a lot of sense when you know what's happening around that. In the Prairies, it was the same thing. There's a lot of people that said, no, we're not doing this, and pulled all of their men out of service. There was also the possible economic benefit that may have motivated people. Let's be honest. The money that was being offered was very good. It sounds a little minuscule today, but I'll go through the stats. Daily pay for a soldier was $1.10. Now, that sounds really small, but it was less than a junior clerk's or an unskilled laborer's wage, but higher than a daily wage of a farm laborer, which a lot of First Nations people were making their money. There's also other benefits. You get clothing, 3 meals a day, free medical and dental care. I haven't come across this on a First Nations, but we see this a lot in the non-First Nations enlistees. They are really super impressed with the free dental. A lot of bad teeth, a lot of lower health standards in the slum areas, so this could have motivated some people. Also, if you enlisted in certain battalions, you got a higher pay scale. You actually ended up getting, I think, $1 extra a day if you went into a railway or a construction battalion. So a lot of First Nations people actually funneled themselves into those ones. We also have these two amazing battalions, the 107th Timberwolf Battalion and the 114th Brock's Rangers. In Britain, they call them Powell's Brigades. In Canada, we're kind of getting desperate by the end of 1914, so we're going to create these things. Originally, the plan was if we're going to have First Nations people in the armed forces, we're going to integrate them with non-Indigenous people to assimilate them. This is different because these are two segregated units of First Nations people. The 114th was actually recruited mostly out of central Canada, mostly out of Six Nations actually. This is where we get most of our enlistees. It was made up of at least 300 that we were able to count, First Nations men, recruited from Grand River, St. Regis, Gunawaga, Munsee, New Credit, Manitoulin Island, Gibson, and actually as far away as Manitoba. Unfortunately for the 114th, it did not reach full strength, so like all battalions in this time, when it went overseas, it was actually broken up as reinforcements. Which means that the 107th has a little bit more of an interesting history. It was actually recruited out of Cree, Sioux, some Mohawks, Onondagas, and Oneidas, Tuscarora, and Delaware, so Six Nations people, and Ojibwe. This was supposed to be a combat regiment, but when they found out that if they went overseas they were going to be broken up, they actually changed over to a construction battalion and were able to stay together as a unit. When the 114th guys went over, a lot of them actually transferred into it. The only problem was their first assignment was the Battle of Hill 70. The Battle of Hill 70 was one of Arthur Curry's first commands. It was taking over a chalk mine area, and these guys were now contracted to dig the trenches. They dug the trenches under open fire, dug them way quicker than they was actually expected, and then when the troops actually moved in, a lot of them stayed behind as stretcher bearers. The bad news is when you do that, you have a high casualty rate. The 107th, due to the fact that they were almost decimated at Hill 70, would eventually be broken up into the rest of the engineering battalions in the Canadian Forces. But this group still remained the one active service, all First Nations service battalions in the First World War. Oh yeah, one of these things, while they were actually trying to get the casualties out, they were caught actually in a German gas attack, which really knocked out their ranks. There were also other military groups or battalions that actually recruited specifically First Nations people. We have the 8th Railway Battalion. This was actually out of Alberta and Manitoba. They actually trained in 3 languages. They spoke Cree, Chippewayan, and Dogrib. So you have one sergeant giving drill orders in 3 separate languages. The commander was actually an ex-fur trader, James K. Cornwall. So he already knew these languages due to his trade. Actually, in some cases, I've actually heard that he had an interpreter too. So he would give the order in English, and then it was interpreted into the 3 languages by the sergeants, and then the men went in. The 135 Middlesex Battalion had 77 Ojibwe, Oneida, and Munsee, Delaware from this area. The 149th Lambton had 67 Ojibwe, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and people from Walpole Island, Stony and Kettle Point Reservation, so once again from this area. The 160th Bruce had 64 Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. The 52nd Bull Moose was mostly Northern Ontario Cree and Ojibwe. The 88th Saskatchewan had recruited heavily, and so did the Winnipeg Rifles. They had 42 Ojibwe and Cree men in their ranks. So what we're also seeing is a lot of these Indigenous communities wanting to keep together when they went and enlisted. As I said, though, most of these battalions will be broken up when they go overseas, leaving them, of course, a little bit isolated from their friends that they had enlisted with. The only time we really see a protest from First Nations communities, I do want to point this out. We talk about the treaties. This was actually the 114th special flag that they had made for their battalion before it went overseas. They actually had to petition the Canadian government for this. And it actually has the clan symbols of Six Nations all through it, but it also has symbols of the British Crown. We have the oak leaves, we have the lion and dragon on top, but it's really a meshing of a visualization of what they thought their alliance relationship was. This flag is actually still preserved at the Woodland Cultural Centre in Brantford. But as I said, the only protest we really see from First Nations groups to enlisting comes with the Conscription Crisis. But you'll notice the three images I have nothing to do with First Nations people. It never got as bad as what we will see in Quebec and other areas, which tells me that the Canadian government saw First Nations protest just the same as any other minority protest, just something we had to deal with. In 1917, Canada is getting desperate for troops, and they start conscription. The problem is First Nations treaties. How are we doing for time, Bob? Good, okay. Really concerned about time because I didn't time this beforehand because, yes, that's how I do things. The conscription crisis really boils things over because according to treaties, this can't happen. But according to the Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Duncan Campbell Scott, it can. When he's written in 1917, will conscription conflict with any treaties we have? He says, no, it shouldn't. The problem is if we read the numbered treaties, especially in the Prairies, there is an open clause that says, no, you will not be pressed into service for the Canadian or British governments. If you want to serve, it'll be voluntary only. Six Nations took a different approach, and that's why they become the most radical of the protesters. Six Nations took on the attitude that, according to our treaties, those wampum belts I showed you, we are allies of Britain. We are an independent nation. We always have been. What you're asking us to do is stop being an independent nation. You can't legally press an independent nation to fight in your forces. Go away. Interesting tactic. The Canadian government, of course, will fight this, and the Six Nations will fight it also. They will send delegations to Ottawa. They will write the Governor General. They even wrote King George. They even sent a representative who was already overseas to have a meeting with King George to plead their case. And he did receive an audience with the king. Unfortunately, we have no records of what they talked about, which is slightly unfortunate for me as a historian. One of the most public displays we see against conscription is actually the fun. And I used to work at the Bell Homestead National Historic Site in Brantford, so anytime I can weave some Alexander Graham Bell into something, I do. So here we go. The only open protest we see from Six Nations happens with the unveiling of this monument in downtown Brantford. It was unveiled in 1917 to celebrate Alexander Graham Bell, of course, inventing the telephone in Brantford. It had a huge British and American connection, of course. Actually, the two figures on either side of the monument were draped, one in the American flag and one in the British flag. And if you read the transcripts of the event, it is very much, thank God the Americans are going to be entering the war. What's interesting is Six Nations had a delegation there who, in the middle of their speech, confronted the Governor General about the conscription issue. Secretary of the Six Nations, Asa R. Hill, actually asked him two things. One, can we be conscripted? According to our knowledge, we couldn't. And two, if we are conscripted, can we at least just keep our men on home defense? We've already committed at this point 300 people, and we don't want to lose any more. His speech reads like almost a punch to the face of the extremely patriotic ceremony that was happening with the celebration of the war effort. Alexander Graham Bell was even there, and his speech is riddled with war references. The Duke of Devonshire doesn't get back to the Six Nations on this. He just stays quiet. Which leads the Six Nations to do something else that they thought was interesting. If they were going to be conscripted, they were going to conscript themselves. They actually made their own conscription cards. It was signed by the Deputy Speaker of the Six Nations Council, Levi General, and on the back actually had excerpts of their treaties. One, the Treaty of Paris, that concluded the Revolutionary War, and the Jay Treaty, both of which state First Nations people will not be molested by the US or Canada. This does not go well. This really sets the bar for what's going to happen next, and that is, of course, Six Nations men will start being arrested and charged for not following the conscription rules. I think in total we have 3 Six Nations men arrested. One is charged and found guilty of not registering. The other one heads to the bush, and we never find him. And the other one, the war ends before his trial even comes up, so they kind of just let the whole thing go. But what's interesting is the relationship this actually has with the city, with the non-Indigenous population surrounding Six Nations. They didn't really seem to care that Six Nations weren't enlisting, and that's mainly because the farmers of Brant County and Haldeman County were also fighting enlistment. So were recent immigrants that were working in Brantford's industrial sector. There was tons of groups that just were fighting conscription. So even to them, they said, you guys can still shop, travel, and do whatever, even if it's against federal law. So the conscription crisis is very odd in that respect. It's one time where Six Nations is openly saying, we're not going to do what the Canadian law says, and no one seems to care. As we have seen recently, that is not nearly the case. In January of 1918, the Governor General finally write an exemption for First Nations people under conscription. He reads the numbered treaties and says, okay, there's a case here, but in his official document, he actually goes one step further. He actually says the reason he's issuing the exemption is because officially, First Nations people, according to Canadian law, are wards of the Crown. They actually have no legal rights in Canada. They cannot vote, they do not pay taxes. So, is this a victory for First Nations people? In a way it is. They are not conscripted. In a way it's not. They've now just had their rights stripped. What's also interesting is this exemption is made extremely public, and it causes confusion. Because according to Duncan Campbell Scott, once again the head of Department of Indian Affairs, they still have to register. They can't be conscripted into service, but they still have to show up to the registration tribunals. Well, this is not really communicated well to the First Nations community. So once again, we get more arrests. We actually get the RCMP arresting First Nations people at a very high rate during this period, mostly due to confusion over this exemption. As I said, though, we have to keep in mind that although this seems slightly radical, it's really not. The First Nations are just one of other groups like French Canada, ethnic minorities, farmers, laborers with families, and even fit men who just didn't want to go overseas were protesting conscription. The federal government was just inundated with exemptions. And so the First Nations people is just one of another group that wanted an exemption. We also have to look at the home front. This is actually one of my favorite propaganda posters ever created by the Canadian government, because it's true. This is, he's actually holding 2 letters that you can still read in the Department of Indian Affairs files, and it was the story of a remote community learning about that the war was on and literally scrounging up the last bit of money the community had and sending it to the Canadian Patriotic Fund. However, as you can see by some of the writing and some of the explanations on the poster, it's a little shifted and a little bit, I'm going to go and say racist, I'm going to use the word. It's not a very nice depiction of what the story actually is. But what I use this poster for is to show there's a lot of money from First Nations communities willingly going into the war effort. If we take a look at this chart, we can see that an absorbent amount of money came from First Nations groups willingly to the war effort. What's also interesting is this is the money that was accepted, not all the money that was offered. First Nations groups offered a lot of money. It was the Department of Indian Affairs who actually held money back, saying that they didn't want to see all of the First Nations money go into the war effort. For this, I usually take a look at, once again, a Six Nations case study. In 1914, the Six Nations Council offered $1,500 and their warriors to the British as a token of their alliance. They tried to send this directly to the British, but of course it got intercepted by the Canadian Department of Indian Affairs, who quickly wrote back and said, you can't do that. What you can do is give it to the Canadian Patriotic Fund, but then that doesn't become an alliance symbol. So they said, no, we're not going to do that. So there's, as I said, $1,500 that's not accounted for. In 1917, Six Nations sent lawyer A.G. Chalsom to purchase $150,000 worth of war bonds. In November 1917, the Six Nations Council authorized the Department of Indian Affairs to invest any and all Six Nations money into Canadian Victory War Loan for a period of 5 years. Six Nations at that point had an absorbent amount of money. I think it was something like $6,200,000, some such. It was just massive. They were willing to give it all. What is really interesting is the Department of Indian Affairs after-war accounting of Six Nations money. According to the Department of Indian Affairs, which these stats are based on, Six Nations Grand River only gave $50. And this wasn't even from the Six Nations Council, it was actually from the Six Nations Patriotic League. So the question becomes, what happened to the $150,000 in war bonds and the offer for all of our money to go into the Victory Loan campaign? We don't know if it was ever accepted or not. We have no record of it. But what we can see with this chart, obviously, is First Nations communities are participating very actively. Six Nations Patriotic League actually starts in August 1914. War breaks out and they are working. They get their first grant of $50 for yarn from the Six Nations Council. By the end of November, they have already made and shipped 36 pairs of socks overseas. These ladies created everything from sweaters, helmet warmers, because tin hats are kind of cold, especially if the wind is blowing the right way. They sent over care packages of cigarettes, playing cards, chocolate, you name it. And they were doing it mostly by grants from the council and by their own private fundraising efforts. This is just one of many patriotic leagues within First Nations communities. Actually, at one point, the Brant County Patriotic League asked them if they could only produce socks. And the reason for that is their knitting was so good that they produced the best socks out of all of Brant County. The veterans eventually do come home. The war has been long, but for some it has been good. Some First Nations people learned to speak English for the first time. some take-home war brides from Europe. A lot of words in traditional languages, traditional battlefield words become translatable into Aboriginal languages. So there's actually growth in traditional word vocabulary. We actually see the first use of Aboriginal language used as codes. So for instance, pointy helmets was translated into a Blackfoot word and used over the wireless, so the Germans would have no idea what was being said. We have revivals and old traditions. Some of these communities had been brought into the colonial fold so much that they were starting to lose some of their warrior societies and some of their traditional practices around warfare. When these veterans come home, a lot of the war dances are revived for the first time since treaties were signed. And even some of the battlefield recordings on hides was brought back into the cultural frame. However, some were not so lucky. Remember that story I told you about the Canadian High Command being concerned that First Nations people would not be shown the civilized warfare that we have come to know and expect? They were right. One of Canada's highest pensioners, due to a disabilities pension, was a Six Nations man by the name of William, sorry, I got the two confused, William Lickers. He was actually a POW and forced to work in a German salt mine. And due to the wonderful dime novels of the time that said Native people felt no pain, he was actually ritually beaten with salt bricks, eventually becoming so paralyzed that, as I said, he becomes the highest grossing pensioner in all the Canadian forces. Some of the men, as I said, come home just the same way a normal veteran does, with a lot of post-traumatic memories. As I said, being under fire, these guys are stressed, fits of cursing, they can be violent at times. Some of them have now developed gambling habits because you're bored in a trench for so long. There's a whole bunch of things that their families are now going to have to readjust to. On top of that, First Nations veterans will also have to be readjusted to the society they left behind, the over-regulated Department of Indian Affairs. Unfortunately, that's what happens to this man. This man's actually a family friend of mine. His name is, and this is why, as I said, I screw this up, he's Wilfred, not William, Wilfred Lickers. So same last name, both start with W. I confuse them all the time. When he went overseas, he had a wife. She passed away just before he went overseas, but he had one child. Soon after he goes overseas, his father passes away. Soon he's assigning all of his pay to his mother and the grandmother of his child, because children usually revert back to the female line in Six Nations culture, so the child was literally given back to his wife's mother while he was overseas. The problem is when it comes time to get his child back, he can't. The Department of Indian Affairs gets involved and won't allow it. If we look at a map of Six Nations, there's a small little reserve off the side called New Credit. And it's for Mississauga First Nations people. His wife was Mississauga. So when Wilfred, a Six Nations man, gave the child to his wife's family, she became part of the Mississauga band roll. The Department of Indian Affairs said if she's a Mississauga band member, she cannot revert back to a Six Nations band member, even though that was his child. Eventually, she will be put in a residential school, and unfortunately, the conclusion is not good. She does not leave the residential school. She does pass away there. In the meantime, while that's happening, he's also a successful soldier settler. The Soldier Settler Program was one of the few benefits that First Nations veterans could apply to. The only way they could apply to all of their veterans' benefits is if they gave up their First Nation status. A lot of them were not willing to do that. So the only one he could actually apply to was becoming a soldier settler. He would get money and start a farm. Unfortunately, the soldier-settler plan, due to no fault of anybody, goes horribly wrong because, of course, they bought all the farm supplies at war-inflated prices, and then the Depression hit. So these guys literally could never pay off the amount of money they took out. He actually survives and actually owns his farm, and 3 generations of his family was actually born and raised there. So he is a very good success story, but as I said, coming out of the war has a very turbulent time. In the Prairies, we see a different story. The soldier-settler program has disastrous results for them, and that is because the Canadian government needs land to put not only First Nation soldiers, but non-First Nation soldiers who are applying to the program. They get their land by taking it out of Native reserves. Here are the Native reserves. My favorite part of this chart, and it's only favorite because it's slightly horrific, is if we look at the small bottom corner, in Saskatchewan, the average was $11.91 per acre was what the Canadian government bought the land for. This is repeated in Alberta, except at a lower rate. The average rate of land taken in Alberta was $10.67 an acre. My favorite, though, is still proving that BC has the highest retail price of property, even back then. They, of course, are getting their reserve land for $79.74. So they're not doing too bad, but the other, in the Prairies, it gets really bad. This leads to what we now call Native organizing. We have 2 ways of doing this in the post-war period. And it's led by these 2 men. Now, weirdly enough, I didn't plan this, but the 2 men are Six Nations. That's a fact. But what they do is something completely different. Remember that representative I told you guys about that actually was told by Six Nations to go visit King George? That's this guy right here. His name is Fred Loft. He's from Six Nations. He was a commander of a railway battalion, and he's a little fed up now. He's come home, and he is not happy with what he sees. What he wants to do, however, is renegotiate with the Canadian government for all First Nations people across Canada. He starts what he calls the League of Indians. He rallies as many as he can from Quebec, Ontario, and all the way through the Prairies. However, it is the 1920s. Roads to some Native communities in the Prairies don't exist. Telegrams, telephone, it's all going to be really expensive. His league falls apart. However, what he is successful of is creating some of the groups that later will become the Assembly of First Nations. He is the direct descendant, his organization is the direct descendant of what we now have as the Assembly of First Nations. The other one is actually not a veteran at all. His name is Descahe, Levi General. He takes a different approach. Remember the time I told you that Six Nations said we're an independent nation? He goes to the League of Nations and tries to prove it. He goes all the way to Geneva. The Canadian government and the British government are not happy with him for doing so. In the end, not only does he not get separate nation status for Six Nations, but he is actually exiled from Canada. He actually will die in the States because Canada will not receive him back into the country for that stunt. However, as I said, this legacy of both of these men continue to current day. And that's what's interesting about the First World War. These groups come together. I like this slide, by the way. This slide is the Prince of Wales coming to Brantford to dedicate their war dead. But what's interesting is if you look on the table, remember that treaty belt, the 2-row wampum belt? It's on the table. They are discussing treaties in 1919 when he comes to visit about their separate nation status. It brings all of these groups together, and in a way that had never been done before, and in a way that we're still going to feel the reverb to this day, and it will continue, of course, after the Second World War. These ideas don't die, they continue. And I'll leave you with one more slide if you are actually at all interested in any of what I just said. Here's a for further reading section. I will point out, this is now self-promotion time, so if you aren't into that, turn your ears off. But if you look, the bottom is the GWCA, Brantford, Brant County, Six Nations. It's a website. If you go on there, you can get the entire Six Nations War story, written by myself and a very dedicated group of volunteers, most of them universities, professionals, librarians, archivists, and it's the entire history of those three communities. So that's it. I think I made my time limit. Yes!